Boom! So now a big story breaking. The United States government is moving to classify 9 different gangs, cartels and drug trafficking organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. Happening now under President Donald J. Trump. Going to have a lot of implications for the United States, for Mexico, for a bunch of places. Now, there's a lot of news coming out on this, developing things happening, but I'll talk about what we know now. So I'm going to go through 3 sections here. First, I'm going to talk about what led up to this happening. Then I'm going to go through the different groups. Right now, we have information about 9 different groups, 6 of them Mexican, 1 Venezuelan, 1 the MS-13 gang, and 1 Colombian mob. And then I'll talk about what the implications of this are. So how did this come about? Well, there's been talk about links between drug traffickers and political guerrilla terrorist organizations going back for a lot of decades. You go back to Peru in the 1980s, and the president there is believed to have coined the phrase narco-terrorist, talking about drug traffickers linked to the Shining Path, like Maoist guerrilla group. Then he goes to Colombia, and you have the Revolutionary Armed Force of Colombia, who were classified as a terrorist organization by the United States. They were a guerrilla group with a Marxist-Leninist philosophy, Castroist philosophy, but they were also involved in running the cocaine trade. Now in Mexico, there's been a lot of tension between the US and Mexico for some years that's getting stronger, and this is to do with various issues of the violence, but also the trafficking of fentanyl. With so many fentanyl deaths in the United States, there's been more pressure from certain prosecutors, certain Republican politicians, certain right-leaning figures saying we've got to classify them as terrorists. There's also been various incidents we see around Mexico. We see like throwing hand grenades into a plaza while people are celebrating Independence Day. We see burning down a casino with dozens of people there playing cards, loads of the croupiers all dying. We see mass graves with more than 300 bodies. So all of this adds to the pressure to designate them. And you saw things like the massacre of 9 Mormon women and children in Sonora in 2019. There was a campaign to designate them then. Now, this was rejected, including by the Trump in his first term, but now Donald Trump is back in office. On his first day, he signed an executive order ordering the government to designate these groups as terrorist organizations. It was seen as showing action. It was seen as fighting the cartels, as taking a stronger line against them, and that's how we arrive at this place. So who are the groups that are being named as foreign terrorist organizations? So we don't have an official exact list yet, but the New York Times, talking to officials off the record, came out with a list of 9 groups, 6 Mexican cartels and 3 other groups from Colombia, from Venezuela, and 1 with links in the US, El Salvador, Honduras and other places. So who are these names? So first of all, we have the Sinaloa cartel. Now this is like a no-brainer that everyone was expecting to be on the list. The Sinaloa cartel is the most infamous drug cartel in Mexico. It's the cartel that El Chapo was from, El Mayo, now the Chapitos, fighting the son of El Mayo. It goes back, it has roots going back decades and decades. Maybe still the biggest trafficker of drugs collectively. A lot of fentanyl, a lot of crystal meth, a lot of cocaine, a lot of marijuana back in the day, a lot of heroin. And they're really big in the state of Sinaloa, but also in many parts of Mexico, in Sonora, in Chihuahua, in Baja California, and in many parts of the country. So you're watching this video and you're really into this world of cartels and organized crime and drugs. If you want to find out more about this, then go to www.crashoutmedia.com. For completely free, you can subscribe and see these great reportage, analysis and breaking news. Or if you like this, then for $5, the price of a couple of cups of coffee, you can get full access and become part of the CrashOut community. Now back to the video. Second cartel I mentioned is the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Again, everyone expects this to be on the list. It's a massive network, the second biggest cartel in Mexico, run by El Mencho, known as the Lord of the Roosters, with many turfs in many states, big drug distribution in the United States. And one thing about the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, based in its state of Jalisco, as it's based, but in many other places, is they're known, as well as trafficking a lot of drugs, a lot of synthetic drugs and cocaine and marijuana back in the day, heroin, as well as the crystal meth and the fentanyl. They're known as being very much a paramilitary organization. A lot of videos of them with hundreds of gunmen showing off their rifles and armor and helmets. And they're known for incidents such as shooting down a Mexican army helicopter and these kind of incidents. Then moving along the border, you have the Gulf Cartel. Again, it's something that people expected to be on the list. It's a very old organization with roots going back to bootlegging alcohol into Texas back in the 1920s, 1930s. More recently involved massively in the 80s in cocaine trafficking. And then also involved very recently in human smuggling over the border, in taking migrants over the border. They really control the Gulf of Mexico, which Donald J. Trump has renamed as the Gulf of America. And the control runs through the cities of Reynosa and Matamoros up to a little township called Los Guerra. Carrying along the border, then you have the Northeast Cartel named. They are really a regrouping of what used to be known as Los Zetas, the Zetas, who were formed by people who defected from the Mexican Special Forces to work for the Gulf Cartel. And they had a reputation then for some quite extreme violence. They've now tried to rebrand themselves, but they're still quite a potent regional organization. Then you've got two groups that was perhaps a surprise that they were mentioned. One is La Familia Michoacana, or La Familia, which is actually, though it's called La Familia Michoacana, the Michoacan family, it's actually really big in the state of Mexico. It dips into a bit of Michoacan, into Guerrero, and these parts of central Mexico. And they're involved in drug trafficking still, but also very much involved in shakedowns and very much a power here, more in the heart of Mexico. Then you have this organization, which is quite a surprise, called Los Carteles Unidos, Cartels United, the United Cartels, which are basically a group of different traffickers, gangsters, old militias, old vigilantes in the state of Michoacan, who have been fighting the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. And they're not really considered the biggest names, but there have been links to people in Michoacan, to drug trafficking in the United States for a lot of years, and this might have got them on the radar. As well as these 6 Mexican cartels, we've got these 3 other organizations. First, the Gulf Clan del Golfo of Colombia. Not a big surprise there. They're often mentioned as one of the world's biggest and region's biggest drug trafficking organizations. Also involved a lot in human smuggling and taxing people who go through Colombia and through the Darien Gap up into the United States. So not really a big surprise there. Then we have El Tren de Aragua, which is a Venezuelan gang. This is not a surprise because they've been very much in the news recently of being active in the United States. But El Tren de Aragua was a gang formed in Venezuela, in one of the prisons there. And it spread around the continent. It spread a lot because there was about 7 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2015 because of the shortage of food and the real meltdown of the economy under the government of President Maduro. And they spread around, and so it became very much a transnational criminal organization and involved in various different crimes, including running prostitutes, including kidnapping, including some local drug selling. And there's a lot of big news about them in the United States. There was this infamous video of members in an apartment block in Colorado with their rifles out, which was a big issue going into the election. And then the last group is the MS-13, the Mara Salvatrucha 13. The MS-13 interesting, they're named as a foreign terrorist organization, but they were actually founded in Los Angeles. And they were mentioned a lot in the first term of Trump's presidency. He's talking about the violence of the MS-13, the animals of the MS-13. They were formed right back in the 1980s in Los Angeles by originally a bunch of kids who were like stoners hanging outside 7-Eleven, who were Salvadoran immigrants and wanted their own gang to kind of survive in the gangland environment of LA in those days. And then they spread out. Some of them were deported back to El Salvador. They spread out there in a big way. They went to Honduras, they went to Guatemala, and then some of them have come back into the United States. So they're also on this list as well. They've been hit a lot recently by the government of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, but they still have some important presence in countries like Honduras, Guatemala, here in Mexico, and also in the United States, both in California, but also they've opened up a big presence over in the East Coast. So what are the actual effects of these groups being named as foreign terrorist organizations, these cartels, these gangs, these drug traffickers? Well, there's really three areas I can see. The first are the legal implications. So that now they can start charging people who work or aid or abet these groups with providing material for a foreign terrorist organization. And that changes a lot of crimes. If someone's, like providing them some infrastructural stuff, some support, money laundering for them, they could be hit under this new law, under this new designation. But also, if somebody's buying guns for the drug traffickers, they could also, whereas before there were these what they know as straw buyers, someone with a clean record who goes to a store in the United States, buys a few AK-47s, a few AR-15s for the cartel, paid a few $100. They could be hit with this, providing material for a foreign terrorist organization, and rather than getting even like probation, they could get 25 years in prison. And there's been a memorandum that was put out by the Attorney General's office of the new Attorney General Pam Bondi, saying they're calling for the total elimination of cartels, which is quite an ambitious thing to say, but saying they really want to hit them with these charges, terrorist charges, look for death penalties, really up the ante with charges. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I think it kind of just changes the whole perspective, it changes the whole game of what you're trying to achieve as a government in fighting these cartels. Whereas before it's like we're against drug trafficking, we're trying to arrest them for drug trafficking. That's a certain directive, but now it's saying we're fighting terrorist organizations. So you're now interested not only in them in trafficking drugs, but in them, the fact they're carrying out these massacres in Mexico, the fact they are, using car bombs and blowing things up and using armored drones and all of these kind of things. That comes into the calculation. You're trying to fight these terrorist organizations. There's also a third thing now, which is one of the things that springs to mind for a lot of people. Could this lead to the US military making strikes against cartels? And the answer is, yes, it could. It's not definite it will, but it could. It doesn't immediately say, because of the foreign terrorist organization, that you've got a right to send in armored drones from the United States or send in commandos and get them. There is actually also another piece of legislation, which is in Congress, called the authorization of the use of military force against cartels. Maybe that'll get approved as well. Maybe it won't, and they could still use this terrorist designation, and if there was a military attack, say the presidency could say challenge me in court. So we could see this, and that's a real possibility. If there was some other attack on US citizens, maybe they could go after a fentanyl lab. We could see those kind of attacks. And if there was US military force used against Mexican cartels, that could lead to all sorts of scenarios. You could see American soldiers coming in, they might kill civilians, there could be violent reactions of cartels against Americans, there could be the Mexican government not wanting to cooperate so much if there were civilians killed, so you could see a real escalation of the situation. But then again, the status quo of cartels, of drug trafficking in the United States has been pretty bad for a lot of years, so we're now breaking that status quo, and let's see what new environment we come into.